Thanks for having me. This is my first time in Toronto and my first time at FITC, so it's been pretty interesting. Today I'm going to talk in depth about two projects that I worked on in the last year, and I'm going to try to give you sort of an idea of the ideas and inspiration behind those projects, but also a lot of the technical details and working process that went into making them a reality. My design studio, Nervous System, consists of myself and Jesse Lewis Rosenberg, so really just two people. And everything you see today is essentially the product of just the two of us doing everything. We started our studio when we were still students as kind of an outlet for cross-disciplinary experiments that didn't really fit into the structure of our educational programs. My background's in architecture and biology, and Jesse's background is in math and computer science, and we wanted to see what happens when you mix all of those things together. Our projects really focus on three areas of interest: science and nature, so coming up with an understanding of how processes in nature shape patterns and form, and this interest really embraces diverse phenomena, so biological, physical, chemical, geological processes. We're also interested in digital fabrication, so what are the new opportunities that are opened up by computer-controlled manufacturing techniques, and how can that change the way that we express ourselves and build the world around us? And our final interest is in co-creation. So what happens when we combine all of these things together and start thinking about new types of design tools we can create that are not only more powerful, but also more accessible and democratic? Our projects typically start with a natural inspiration. Our HYPHE project from 2010 was based on how veins form in leaves. We translated that natural inspiration into an algorithmic system that we can explore that pattern space in, and ultimately generating structures that aren't found in nature, that are completely digital and unique. And then moving from there, we typically develop entire consumer product collections that are generated by that. So this is a 3D printed lighting collection we created called HYPHE as well in 2011 that leverages digital fabrication to produce all one-of-a-kind products. So every single lamp we make is always unique. Digital fabrication, like I said, opens up lots of new possibilities. There are a few things about it that are really unique compared to traditional manufacturing techniques. So one is an object like this, which is incredibly complex, would be basically fundamentally impossible to make by any traditional manufacturing technique. You can't cast this, you can't mold this. However, digital fabrication, specifically 3D printing, can make this just as easily as you can make a solid cube of plastic. There's no difference to the machine. And that's really interesting to me. Additionally, there's this idea that variation is free. So let's say I want to make 1,000 customized prosthetics, every single one different. That is super easy to do with digital fabrication, but very expensive to do normally. And then the last thing that's really interesting is the way in which digital fabrication can lower barriers to creation. So traditionally, making is in the hands of people who have years of experience with professional manufacturing workflows like investment casting or injection molding. But now 3D printers and other digital fabrication tools are in people's offices, they're in libraries, and they're even in people's homes. And that's making more available to more people. However, this is kind of all a lie, everything I just told you. That's what the machines are capable of, but that's not actually the reality. The reality is, although the machine can make complex stuff and can make infinite variation, and they're everywhere and they're really cheap, how do you design things for that process? Right now, there's not a good answer to that. Software is a really missing component. Design software does everything I just told you about traditional manufacturing. It makes it really hard to make complex things. It makes it really hard to make variations. It's very expensive, and you need years of experience to make solid printable parts. So part of what we're thinking about at Nervous System is how can we create new types of playful design experiences that really leverage simulation and web technologies to make this making possibility available to more people. And we're calling these experiences co-creation. This is an app that we created in 2010 called Cell Cycle. It runs entirely in your browser, sort of in real time, and lets you sculpt relatively complex forms that would be very difficult to make in any normal 3D modeling program. And instead of actually defining every part of the structure, you're sort of interacting with an algorithmic system, a simulation in the background that's taking care of some of it for you, but letting you interact in a way of more fluidly. So instead of actually drawing things, you're sort of pushing and pulling, twisting and sculpting, applying forces to make jewelry pieces that you can ultimately order in all different types of materials. So people have used this to make custom wedding bands and other things that are very personal to them with no design experience. So the first project I'm going to tell you about is one that we're actually currently working on. So it's completely not finished, and this is the first time I'm talking about it or showing it to anybody. And it's sort of maybe called Floriform. I'm not totally sure yet. Organic form itself is found, mathematically speaking, to be a function of time. We might call the form of an organism an event in space-time and not merely a configuration in space. I'm really into this quote by Darcy Thompson from 1917 and his book on growth and form because it really encapsulates for me a really fundamental truth of everything around us, is that all of the forms that we see in nature are the result of complex dynamic processes. And these are processes that are capable of growing and adapting to all sorts of different conditions. And then the resultant forms that we see are an expression of those complex processes and also the conditions that generated them. And I see this idea of form as process as a really interesting counterpoint to how humans have traditionally designed objects. So, strangely, humans take a very top-down approach to design. We essentially directly specify the form that we're creating at the very beginning of the design process. We'll give it precise measurements, precise shape and dimensions at the very beginning. And people are often really interested in computers because they think they can offer a kind of new method of making. But actually, almost all design software that you look at really just tries to mimic or reproduce methods of how we made things before computers. So we have things like software that give you the simulated experience of drawing, or painting, drafting, model making, sculpting. All of these things that we did before, we're now trying to translate them into an analog of what is that in the computer. And additionally, this is sort of like material-based. Like before we worked with paper and clay and wood, and what's it like to work with paper, clay, and wood like simulated in a computer? And part of what we're doing with our work, and which is I'm going to try to get at with this project, is proposing a different direction for that. So what if we can take inspiration for all the forms we see in nature, these process-based designs, and really kind of focus on creative interactive processes that we can engage with? So what if instead of making static objects, we create these dynamic processes, or instead of specifying and drawing something, we grow things? So then, hopefully I still have you at this point. This project deals with differential growth and the development of form in biological processes. Kind of the essential question, if you're a biologist, is how do you go from a single cell to a complex differentiated structure? So all of us in here started out as a single cell, but somehow we ended up as functional human beings capable of incredible acts. And the answer to that is sort of complex. If you think about if you have one cell and it starts to divide and grow, and it did that uniformly, you'd kind of just end up with a formless blob, just a functionless lump. But that's not what we see. So apparently there's sort of carefully coordinated subdivision and differentiation, and through that, biological systems can produce structures with sort of incredibly specific functions and forms that are reproducible. So maybe part of the answer is that if you have a structure, some parts of it are growing more and some parts of it are growing less, and that leads to the final result. We could call this just differential growth. You're not growing uniformly, you're growing differentially. So that kind of, for me, poses some fundamental questions. So one of them is maybe how does differentiated growth at the cellular level lead to complex macroscopic forms? And then flipping that around, how do those macroscopic forms go back and influence the underlying processes? What is this interplay between cellular processes and the mechanics of biological materials? And how does that inhomogeneity occur and lead to the differentiated structures we see? It turns out that almost the entire body plan and all the structures we see in an organism are imprinted very early in its development. It starts with just an extremely simple gradient, and that gradient in the embryo can act as a positional map for almost every cell. So based on the concentration of one thing, you can tell, oh, I'm at the head of an organism, or I'm at the butt. And from that, we can start to trigger this incredible sequence of cascades of genetic pathways that produce other morphogens, which define other gradients, leading to this segmented form in a fly. That's what you're looking at, is a fly embryo stained for 3 different types of gradients, morphogens. Organisms are also affected by environmental gradients. So in plants, we have a very well-studied series of behaviors called tropisms. These are directional growth responses to directional stimuli. Plants are able to aim their growth towards nutrients and away from hostile environments. They can respond to light and water and humidity and nutrient availability, and even things like gravity and touch. As they're growing, that sculpts the form that results. These plant movements, we could just consider them really well-documented examples of differential growth. It becomes sort of very simple when you think about it like this. You have a plant, it wants to grow toward the sun. If you're thinking about it in 2 dimensions, how does it do that? It lengthens more on one side than the other. There's this differential elongation. And maybe if you're thinking about that as a surface, you have maybe 2 layers, and one layer lengthens more than the other layer, causing curvature to develop. So you can use that actually to explain really amazing things like the blooming of tulips that happens due to the differential growth due to temperature changes. This project actually got started for us when we read a paper by a professor at Harvard called Mahadevan. And, well, that's his name, so I guess that's what he's called. But he proposed a kind of different take on the idea of differential growth. From looking at the shapes of leaves and flowers, he noticed these kind of ruffles on the edge. And he proposed sort of a mathematical model that said that you could explain these forms by a surface growing differentially from its edge. So rather than the sided growth model, there's not really a direct relationship between the curvature and the resultant form. So this seems pretty interesting to us, and I started noticing ruffled forms kind of everywhere I looked. Different types of flowers, things at the supermarket like cabbages and kale, succulents in my office, jellyfish, anemones, lettuce slugs, so like things that aren't even plants like fungus. Basically every kingdom of life, there's some forms that can be explained by this process, it seems like. And then I started just thinking about growth more in general. So this is basically my favorite plant. It's called Celosia, and the form on the right is called Celosia cristata, and the one on the left is the normal form. Normally this plant is like going around doing its business, and it grows these cylindrical flowers. Sometimes you get an odd mutation in the growing point where instead of continuing to grow as a cylinder, it starts to lengthen into a line, and that gives this incredibly convoluted form. So I guess sort of at the start of this project, I was thinking about all these things like differential growth and plants, but I saw this far as like, how can we create an algorithmic system that can explore this space of the mutated growth and the normal growth? So when you start to create a model of something, you actually are trying to simplify it as much as possible. You want to boil it down to what is the most basic description of this material or system, which will give the behaviors that you're interested in. So what you're looking at are some microscopic photographs of plants. You can see that leaves are made up of all of these cells, and they have turgor pressure and cell walls and all sorts of properties. They have vascular bundles or veins. Basically, we throw all of that out. We're like, this is too complicated. We're just going to boil it down to the simplest type of material you can model. And the simplest type of material you can model has something called isotropic linear elasticity, which sounds really complicated, but it's a simple idea. Let's just say you have something, you apply a force to it, it's going to respond with a proportional deformation to the amount of force you apply. Let's say we want to make it even simpler, right? Like 3D materials are really hard to model, but our things are essentially flat. So what if instead of thinking about them as fully 3D materials, we could just think about them as like 2D surfaces embedded in 3D space. And we can build what we might call a thin shell model. So taking our leaf surface, discretizing that into something we can do computations on, in this case triangles, we can break down this elastic behavior into almost 2 different types of behavior, something that resists stretching and something that resists bending. So we end up with a mathematical model that's a lot of triangles with springs on their edges that resist stretching, and then a kind of idea about the angle in between every face that resists bending. So we construct a model. This part, it takes a long time, not just a second. It takes months or even years. And we program it to have its first behavior, and that's growing uniformly. So we take a hemisphere and we just grow it the same everywhere. And what do you end up with? You end up with this wrinkly blob. This is sort of what I predicted at the beginning. Uncontrolled, undifferentiated growth doesn't have any interesting behaviors. What about if you think about it growing from a single point, like a plant has this thing called the apical meristem, and then we split that point? We get this behavior of branching. Now, what if instead of growing from a point, you disturb that point and start to lengthen? Then we can create this type of mutant behavior that's very similar to something you see in cacti. And this, of course, is what I was interested in to begin at the beginning. This is the idea of growing differentially from the edge. If you grow more at the edge than everywhere else, you produce these ruffled forms. So this is kind of like the very beginning of the project. Like you have this idea, you study it, you produce a mathematical model, and then you think, now what? What am I supposed to do with this? How do I turn this into a project? So this image kind of stands in to represent our philosophy for how we work with kind of complex dynamic systems. I would almost describe our practice as a kind of digital gardening, but instead of cultivating plants, we're essentially cultivating algorithms. And we ultimately want to create or breed systems that kind of have their own innate behaviors, but that we can also manipulate and sculpt. As we're developing the software, we constantly are thinking about how to encode sort of sets of influencers, gradients, and manipulators that enable us to sculpt its behaviors and growth. And there's an interplay between what the system does innately and our manipulations. This is really like a kind of back and forth between us and the system as we continue to change and reconstruct it, re-encoding how it fundamentally works. So now I'm going to show you some of the things that we're kind of twiddling with in the background, trying to figure out how to control the system. So the first idea is just changing base parameters of the system. What if we change the bend strength, so how much it resists bending? So the less it resists bending, the more it ruffles, and sort of the more it resists bending, the larger the wavelength of that ruffle is. We can introduce sort of kind of normal ideas like gravity. So everything on the planet grows under a force all the time, a directional force, and that gives it directional behavior. The neat thing is, in code, we don't have to go in any one direction. We can go in all sorts of directions and change those directions. This is sort of the idea of what if you change the effect of the growing edge on the rest of the surface as you grow. So what if the influence of the morphogen that's diffusing dissipates very quickly or very slowly, and what sort of different results does that yield? We're thinking about anisotropic growth, so before we're kind of growing all in the same direction, but actually you could have it grow in a particular direction, for instance, in the same direction as the edge, or opposite of that. This is playing off the fact that plants have directional elongation in their cells. This one is sort of a bit more expressive. It's the idea of maybe almost petals. So what if we think of the growing zones as being something that we can divide up into these discrete points, and how does that affect the resultant symmetry of the growth pieces? So we sort of find that as we increase the number of points, we get different symmetry, but also there's a kind of interplay between what the surface can do, the amount it can bend, and what we're asking it to do that gives relatively different types of results. This one is 6 points. Now this one's my favorite. It's 5 points. And just bizarrely, it's incredibly symmetric and forms this spiraling result that I really didn't expect at all. It's rare when you're working with a very complex system like this to find something that's like some perfectly mathematical looking thing because there's so many things going on, but that one, sort of the wavelength fits in perfectly. Here we're playing with the idea of making the surface thinner. And since our surface is essentially just a 2D surface, the thinness is sort of modeled as scale. And that produces a fractal effect where the thinner the surface gets, the smaller the wavelength. One of the simplest ideas is maybe you could just change the growth rate through space. So maybe on the right, it's much more capable of growing on certain zones than others, whereas on the left, the growth potential is sort of uniform. So now I'm going to give you this kind of very brief explanation of how the system works. And I feel like this is pretty important just to not just have forms show up on the screen and they're like, how did that happen? And just not tell you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. So basically we have a predefined surface, and we're going to bring that into our system, and we have to do some stuff on it to make it swing to a simulation on it. After that, we essentially have a big loop that is changing our surface through time. And that loop has to do a physics simulation, so we have to run a physics step and compute new positions for all of our vertices. Then we have to grow, which means essentially lengthening every edge in the mesh. We have to also compute the geodesic distance, which is the distance from any point on the surface to the growing zone. And we're doing that using this actually really cool new method from a paper in 2013 called Geodesics in Heat, which approximates the geodesic distance through the integration of the gradient of heat and diffusion. The physics step is kind of complicated, but I could sum it up for you by saying that we have a lot of different forces going on, and we have to compute all of them for every vertex and add them up. So we have stretching and bending and contacts that come from collision detection. We have gravity. All of that has to be summed up and then integrated implicitly with an Euler solver. We also have a kind of naive vision of collision detection where we built an ellipsoid around every vertex, and the size of that is sort of precisely determined. And then if those ellipsoids sort of interact with each other, we have to create a force that pushes back out normal from the surface. And that's how we prevent our surface from intersecting with itself, which is pretty important for a realistic behaving surface. And this is kind of what that looks like if you're like looking behind the scenes. We have this mesh, it's constantly getting adaptively subdivided, and all the mesh's components have to be kept pretty equilateral for that system to work. So we've started translating these digital explorations into 3D printed sculptures. And part of that is we're kind of working on combining some of our algorithmic systems together. So I showed you earlier that we had that hyphae system, which is based on how veins form in leaves. What if we kind of run that on top of this system to create a mashup between the two algorithms? We're also exploring using full-color 3D printing to materialize some of these forms. And what I'm interested in this is that we can use the color to directly indicate the growth rate of that surface. Use the podium. Can I take this off? Sweet. And the thing that you saw on the bottom that was kind of moving around is something that we're doing that's based on 19th century zoetropes. So we're using these animated sculptures to indicate the growth process physically. We're also working on a jewelry collection that's based on the system. This is kind of how we actually make money. We work on all these abstract research ideas, but we're not professors and we don't have grants. What we actually do is we turn them into products. And we feel pretty strongly that really big abstract ideas about the universe should actually be encoded into everyday objects that are affordable, that can diffuse into our everyday lives. They shouldn't just be limited to academic or theoretical explorations. Even like simple objects in your life can embody very complex ideas. Okay, so now I'm going to switch tracks completely and tell you about this other project we've been working on called kinematics. And if the first project wasn't your cup of tea, hopefully you'll like the second project better, because they're sort of working on really like polar opposite spectrums of the things we do. So in the summer of 2013, we were contacted by the Advanced Technology and Projects group at Google, and they wanted us to work on this kind of insane project that they were doing. They had a van, and they filled it with 3D printers and laser cutters and other digital fabrication tools, and they're planning to drive it across the country. And what they wanted us to do was create design experiences where anybody could walk up to this van, design something, and have it made for them in under an hour and walk away with it. And ostensibly, these were supposed to be accessories for the Moto X cell phone, because Google owned Motorola. So the sort of first problem we have, actually, is that 3D printing is really slow. It looks like the thing on the right's emerging before your eyes, but that took 8 hours. Nobody's going to walk up to the van and then wait 8 hours for something to be made. So we need to make something that can be made quickly. So we started thinking about the idea of, can you print something flat, taking advantage of the fact that 3D printing can make complex interlocking mechanisms, and then have that transform into a wearable shape afterwards. This is the idea of like a watch band. It's flat, and then it bends to your wrist. But we started thinking about it maybe in terms of, instead of linear elements, maybe a network of things that are all printed together. So, and then each element in that could be a customizable unit. These were all made on just a MakerBot replicator desktop printer, like the cheapest, easiest to use printer, the lowest sort of quality of technology you can get, but none of them had to be assembled. And we ended up making a kind of like web application that you could use on a touch screen, where you would walk up to the van, design your bracelet, have it printed, it'd have an NFC tag in it so you could interact with your phone. And we took the van to different maker fairs and universities, and people from sort of all walks of life and age groups came up, designed something, had it fabricated, and walked away with a completely customized thing that they designed and made. At the end of the project, we were kind of just left with these like weird bracelets. They were kind of these interesting artifacts that maybe hinted at something approaching fabrics, but made with a 3D printer. And I started thinking about fabrics more in general as a kind of constructed material. So the neat thing about them is that if you're wearing a t-shirt that's knit or something that's woven, a lot of the properties that have come from how we've arranged the material in space. It's not from the fact that it's made of cotton or wool. It's from how we have interlocked that material together. So it's sort of like a complete human transformation of materials. There's also a really interesting history of those materials not only being sort of constructed, but also computationally constructed. So this is the Jacquard loom, which was first demonstrated in 1801. It used these punch cards to encode very intricate weaving patterns that produce these richly illustrated textiles that you see on the left. And you might actually think of this as the very first computer was made to create textiles. Or maybe if you don't want to call it the first computer, it's at least a very important predecessor. But I was really fascinated by the way in which textiles have this computationally mediated history. And maybe 3D printing them wouldn't be so weird to think about as a way to make textiles. It's, after all, just a way to make even more complexly arranged metamaterials that are all organized in space differently and can maybe have even more advanced behaviors than we see in normal textiles. So we started thinking about what we had already made. And basically, we had this kind of thing that has a really interesting quality between being hard and soft. It's made of all these hard pieces, but it kind of has a flow like fabric. And we thought, how would this work if I wanted to make a dress out of this? Like, how would a big dress made out of this weird hard, soft material move and flow? How would that be different from a normal dress? But then the first problem we had was we're printing on printers that are about this big. And how do we make a dress? It's quite large. This is a kind of actually common problem in digital fabrication. People want to make something big with the newest technology, and they think, I'm going to generate a shape, and then I'm going to cut it down into 1,000 unique small parts. I'm going to have to organize those parts, and then I'm going to have to assemble them by hand into the final object. And for me, this is a little bit ridiculous, right? You took computation, and you made your problem a lot harder. You could have just gotten some bricks, and they're all the same, and assembled them together, but instead you're like, I'm going to organize more than 1,000 unique parts together. And we were thinking, well, like, we don't want to do that. Maybe we can actually somehow make it all as one piece. And then we kind of had a clever idea. I'm a bit proud of this part. So we thought about the fact that we're making something flexible. So I'm making this thing. And if I wanted to make this like this, I'd need a machine as big as my arms. But what if I go like this? Oh, look, I made it a lot smaller. Could I somehow make it in this shape? And this idea is like really stupid, but also in some ways really sophisticated. So how can we maybe leverage simulation to calculate this form, a better, more efficient form for making something, and then maybe you could print it in this shape, and then we could unfold it into its intended shape out of the machine. And once you start thinking about making clothing entirely in 3D, it kind of starts to change how you think about clothing in general. Normally, clothing is, goes from a body, which is three-dimensional, and then you map it to a flat set of pattern pieces that are made out of a flat piece of fabric that somebody has to cut out painstakingly and then reassemble to make a 3D object. But maybe if we're printing our garments all as one piece, we could just stay in 3D the whole time. You could start by capturing an exact 3D scan of any person and then turn that into a garment that could be made in a completely automated process that would never require cutting, assembling, or sewing anything. So we started working on this project with this grand idea, and in some cases, not a lot of sense of whether it would work or not, but it has a number of different avenues of research in it. It has 3D printing problems, design problems, how do you even generate these structures, problems to do with bodies, how do you capture somebody's body shape, how do you make sure you fit a garment to their body shape, and then questions to do with simulations, like I claimed we could do this really complicated simulation, and can we actually do that, and is that actually more efficient than making it out of parts? So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit. So the first thing you have to know is that we're not using this FDM desktop 3D printing anymore. We're using industrial grade machines that work on a different process. Instead of having a piece of filament that they squeeze out, they have a big bed of powderized nylon and a laser. The laser moves over the nylon and it melts it together area by area to produce a solid part. And the really nifty thing about it is that there's always this unmelted powder everywhere supporting our part. So as it's built up, we can make sort of shapes of arbitrary complexity, and at the end, we can excavate them from the powder, and we have a finished part. And the support material can generally be reused. So this is sort of what this thing looks like, what we want to make. We want to make these hinged, tessellated structures. And part of the problem we have is just problems of machines and technology. So the machine is using nylon. We have to make a part that's going to be durable on nylon and also has certain tolerances and degrees of error. And those are actually different depending on the orientation of your part. So if you want to print something that's crumpled up in a ball, there's no specific orientation to any component. So as you're thinking about how you're going to design this mechanism, you have to think it's going to have all different strengths and problems depending on how it's printed. You have to design for that. This is just kind of a very small selection of all of the joints that we designed, prototyped, and physically tested for this project. And essentially the problem is that we want the hinge to be as small as possible because that lets us make smaller triangles and more fluid behavior. But that means that we're working essentially at the very smallest, closest space of the tolerance of the machine, just barely above what it can make. And that leads to a number of problems and difficulties. If we make our sort of gap space in our hinge too small, they'll fuse together. And instead of a part that rotates, I'll have a lump of plastic. And if I make them too big, the whole thing could fall apart. Or we might have this sort of like flowing behavior that we actually really liked. We started prototyping the idea very small. Since we're a small studio, we don't really have any money, let's say, and we didn't want to test it out on a giant dress that we didn't know it would work on. So we started with something small, a crumpled up necklace, and we printed that, and it unfolded to a necklace. So we moved up to a belt, this thing. So this was made from a 3D scan of me that was made using a Microsoft Kinect, and that also worked. So we scaled up again to a full-scale garment. This one is the first one we made that was made of thousands of interlocking parts. This is a considerably bigger question whether anything would fuse together across a larger distance of the print bed, and also if our simulation actually can handle this many interconnected parts. At the same time we were thinking about that, we had a sort of fundamental problem. Everything I just showed you was produced by code with no user interface, so it's just like directly programmed what we'd get out. We didn't have a way to sort of go in and design these types of structures interactively, so you couldn't determine the shape or pattern. But we wanted to make a way that anybody could design clothing, so that wasn't going to work. So we produced a WebGL application, which you're about to see. This is called Kinematics Cloth, and it runs entirely in your browser. And it's intended to be sort of, I guess it's the world's first 3D modeling software for 3D printable clothing or some such. But it works off of body models or 3D scans. And there's a sort of intuitive interface where you can go in and paint and sculpt the garment, determining the shape and the silhouette and also the pattern of the structure. And then you can save designs, you can share them, you can edit them later, and all of this happens in the browser. So kind of at the heart of this, it turns out, is a remeshing algorithm, this idea that we wanted people to, in real time, be able to go in and paint the structure, and how do we do that in a way that's going to be interactive and responsive. So we came up with this kind of iterative remeshing algorithm that's constantly happening in the background where there's a triangulation that's being updated based on the user's input. So we have to do a lot of operations like edge splitting, collapsing, and also really watch out for the quality of our triangles because we need to be able to insert hinges of a specific size on them. So we have to prevent bad triangles essentially by smoothing and edge flipping. And then additionally, we need this to fit your body. So we're constantly projecting everything on your body surface. You can also paint different module styles, so you don't have to have a garment made of holes if you don't want to. You could have one with solid panels or one with things coming out of it, or really anything in between. There's also a question of the bodies. So I told you could make a garment on your body, but how does that work? Increasingly, there's sort of 3D scanners everywhere. Like your phone is soon going to have a 3D scanner in it, and there are Microsoft Kinects that have 3D scanners. They're actually depth cameras. And we thought, why not use these depth camera scanners to collect people's body shapes? But it turns out that 3D scanners are really, really difficult to use. They produce messy, inaccurate data. And there are sort of fundamental problems like areas of shadow on your body can't be measured or captured, so there'll be holes in your data. You could go in and manually fix that. So every scan we make, we'd have to fix it by hand. But that's kind of a big problem. And even ignoring all of that, let's say you have perfect 3D scan data, how do you recognize where somebody's neck is? How do you recognize where their armhole is or waist? Those are things you need to know to design a garment. And also, like, let's say somebody's standing funny or slumped over. That's going to affect their measurements and how a garment's going to fit. We have to know about all of that. So we actually luckily met a group of people who are solving this exact problem at the same time we were thinking about it, called Body Labs. And they have developed a parametric body model based on sort of machine learning from thousands of scans of different people's bodies. And essentially, they have a way of mapping any 3D scan data from whatever device onto their parametric model and producing a clean mesh that we can use in our app. And that also includes a sort of interface where if you don't have access to a scanner, you can use measurements to construct a very accurate 3D model. This lets us do kind of neat things like map a garment from anyone's body to anyone else's body, because we have a sort of mesh topology that maps between every person with the same features in the same places. And now we arrive at the heart of the issue, simulation. This is the hardest part in some ways. And our idea was to use rigid body physics to represent the physical movements of our structure. So we could represent maybe every rigid part of this as a collision body and every mechanism between them as a constraint. And we went through a number of different physics libraries. It turns out there's always kind of a tension, and probably everybody's work, of do you develop your own tools or do you use something off the shelf? In this case, we thought, well, this is a pretty complex thing, and there are a lot of tools for this. Probably we can find something off the shelf that will do this. And ultimately, we discovered that nobody else is trying to fold 3D printable clothing items using rigid body physics solvers, and there are lots of problems we have in our particular case that don't actually get met in any off-the-shelf libraries we can use. But we are currently using the physics library by NVIDIA, which has the negative of being proprietary, but the positive of being graphics accelerated, also currently under development, so it's very modern. So this is kind of how it works. There's no way to simulate the printable geometry. It has millions and millions and millions of polygons. It's just computationally impossible. But we can use the underlying design triangulation to figure out a simpler thing to simulate. So we can make a kind of minimal version of it that consists of wedges and cylinders and one-dimensional rotation constraints, hinges, that connect it all together. One kind of interesting problem or problematic issue is that our actual thing is really loose. It has a gap in between every hinge that prevents it from fusing together in the machine. But our simulated thing is idealized. It doesn't know about the looseness of our actual structure. So when we first started simulating these, we found that our models were not folding up very tightly, and they were tending to bind in the simulation, whereas our real thing is very fluid and can fold tightly. So the way we address that is actually by introducing error into our system to allow it to fold in the sort of configurations that our real model would. But then at the end, we actually have to remove all that error because we have no space within our hinge for anything to be even slightly off axis. If it has any error whatsoever, it'll fuse together. So we have to refit all the data after we've folded it. Once you've done all of that, which is I guess what we actually do, we get to do the fun stuff, which is thinking about how you can use these types of simulations to model the behavior of complex structures. So let's say I'm designing 3 different types of dresses, and I want to create different patterns of tessellation. How does that affect how they drape and move? And if I start designing for that, then I can go back and tweak my design, see how that drapes and moves, and then there's this sort of interplay back and forth between the simulation and the design process, which is really neat. And then the final thing that we came up with was this idea of folding, essentially. At the beginning, I was telling you, what if we just crumple up a design to fit it in the printer? I was like, if I can at least get it in the printer, then I can say that this idea is successful. But it turns out that just randomly crumpling something up into a ball is not very efficient, and it wastes a lot of space. So what if instead of doing that, we carefully fold it through a series of collisions into a nice form? So this is like putting a piece of clothing in your dresser. You don't just ball it up. You actually fold it with some knowledge of the shape. So we did that, and we were able to reduce the bounding box of our volume by over 85% to make it very efficient for printing. So this video then was recorded about 9 months after we started the process. And we'd actually met a curator from the Museum of Modern Art, Paola Antonelli, at another event. And she had seen our initial video that I showed you, and she was very interested in the idea of the museum acquiring one of our dresses for their permanent collection. And frankly, I don't know if she knew that we'd never made one and weren't even sure if we could actually do it. But she had a very important meeting that only happens a couple of times a year where they present objects to their board of directors or something, and they say, yes, we will acquire this. So the day arrived that we were at the factory, basically the day before they needed the dress at the MoMA, watching it come out of the printer for the first time and trying to find out, is this going to work? Will the dress unfold? And will we be able to take this over to Paola Antonelli or not? And sort of as you're seeing in the video, we did actually do it. The very first dress, it was able to unfold from the printer. And we're all like, hooray! And then I frantically called my friend on the phone, and I said, you have to get down to the factory in Long Island City and put this on. So this is my incredibly amazing friend, Lana Bracella, who was like, I'll be there. And she came and put it on. And for us, it was so exciting to see the dress come out of the machine and go directly onto a person's body with no assembly. We're also, just captivated to see the movement of the garment. So it's about how it flows and moves and has this kind of hybrid between soft and hard. And also the idea that it's wearable. A lot of 3D printed garments that you may have seen in the past, not only are they made of multiple pieces that are assembled together, but they're actually like rigid, hard sculptures that you'd walk around in and don't flow or conform with your body at all. And this is kind of boring, but for me it's really cool. The fact that the simulation actually accurately predicted the shape of the garment that it would really have in real life was very exciting for me, because it sort of hints at the power of this type of design system in the future. So this then is the dress, the first dress that we made. It's a custom fit garment. It's composed of more than 2,200 interlocking triangular panels, and they're interconnected with more than 3,300 hinges. And the entire thing was printed as a single piece in nylon. While each component is rigid, in aggregate, they behave like a continuous fabric and sort of flow and conform to the body and respond to movement. Unlike traditional fabric, though, this textile is not uniform. It varies in rigidity, drape, flex, porosity, pattern, all sort of through space. And it's entirely customizable from fit to pattern and everything in between. We sort of see this as really just the first step in a larger project that's about how can we leverage digital fabrication to create new types of complex digital materials and products, and how can we further kind of empower the design process through engaging in simulation and co-creation. So that is all that I have, and I don't know if I left any time for questions, but if I did, we could maybe have a question, like 4 minutes of questions if they're each 1 minute long. Does anybody have a question? You.
I had a question about the fluoroform. What is the stopping point, and is there a point of diminishing returns where the form doesn't look as nice, or does it, break at a certain point?
Well, yes, there is the point at which it breaks. Because normally there's some sort of extremely complex simulation you're trying to run. If you try to run it forever, it eventually something goes wrong. In our case, it's normally that our triangles kind of become malformed and some of our edges collapse, which Jesse probably doesn't want me to tell you. But in general, I wouldn't really say, sometimes it makes ugly things and sometimes it makes pretty things. I guess I'm not really thinking a lot about it along that trajectory, but more developing and re-encoding the system to make things that I like. That doesn't really answer your question, but I'm going with it. Not really. 3D printing is actually kind of stagnated for the past 30 years and not really seeing the introduction of any new technology whatsoever, partially due to patents. But the ultimate dream is to have the triangles be so small you can't see them. So you're reaching more of that fabric behavior, but it's not there yet. Part of this depends on, the stuff I was hinting to about patents locking up development. But in general, 3D printing is doing more things with multi-materials. So printing things that have a gradient in space of different mixtures of behaviors. There's electronics printers that are currently in development that are going to make it possible to print sort of whole functional products in one go. And I think that's going to really be the future of 3D printing. So all of the things that you saw on the screen are all software that we coded ourselves. So there's different web applications. The second project is mostly all JavaScript, and the first project is mostly all C++. And we sort of develop all these tools in-house to do what we're trying to do. There sadly isn't off-the-shelf software that really makes any sense right now for doing this sort of complex simulation-based work on 3D geometry. Some things have entropy and some things don't, depending on whether we introduce the entropy or not. Some things have like initial distribution of points that are distributed in a slightly noisy but even way called blue noise, and that can lead to unique results. Other things have a noise function encoded into it that does like all sorts of stuff, so depends. I think more and more we're interested in maybe releasing things that we've built, but since we're like a design studio of 2 people and we do like everything from design, like web-based and coding and simulation and photography and like every aspect of it, we have sort of limited time to achieve that goal. But let's go with sort of. We have like some libraries and things that we've released, but it's not, I wouldn't say, significant portion of our work. One more question, that guy.
What does it feel like when you're wearing that?
Well, I have some sample pieces with me, so if you want, you can like sort of feel them at the end of this talk. But the answer that I've been giving, because people ask me this question a lot, is mechanical lace, and interpret that however you want.